Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Welcome to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and joining me tonight are board members from the organization Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. Joining me in this segment is attorney Kristina Leslie and board member Paul O'Shea. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining me.
Good to be here.
Thank you for having us.
So the organization has existed since 1991, but under a variety of different names. I think probably, Paul, you could walk us through a little bit of sort of the formation of the organizations and some of the original members who came to the board to help set up the organization.
Unfortunately, I haven't been with VADP that long, about 2 years, so I'm not really fluent with how it started. So I'm sorry, I can't do
So you've got board members now. You said you had some very interesting stories about the people who are with the organization currently, sort of the driving force behind the work that's being done.
Yes, I started in the anti-death penalty movement about 20 years ago, first with the ACLU and then with the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. And while I was on the board, I met two very interesting people, one of whom is Juan Melendez, who grew up in Florida, is from Puerto Rico, and was convicted of murder in the state of Florida. And even though he had 4 alibis in his case and was still convicted, he spent 16 years on death row before his attorney discovered in files that there was testimony, there was evidence that could have exonerated him. So the state of Florida decided not to retry him. He was ultimately exonerated. He spent 17 years, 8 months, and 1 day on death row for a murder which he did not commit. That's 6,886 days on death row. The state of Florida gave him $100 in compensation. And now Juan travels the world talking about his conviction and his exoneration. Just a remarkable story.
It is, and it's not an unusual story, is it, Kristina?
Unfortunately, it's not, Catherine. It's not at all.
So we've had probably, I think I saw somewhere, it may have been on the VADP website, about 140 exonerations of people sitting on death row waiting to be executed who were exonerated by evidence that was not previously. DNA is pulling out of the files DNA that tells you it is the wrong person has been enormous. I mean, moving forward, Paul, what do you think it is the public needs to know about the movement to abolish capital punishment in this country?
Well, we're making progress toward that eventual happy solution. The number of exonerations, I think, is 156 so far. I think it's 1 in every 11 executions, something of that nature. So it's just astonishing that all of these people who are now alive could have been murdered by the state. And that's one of the reasons why I got involved in this, because I regard it as a moral issue as well as it has a significant number of imperfections, if you will.
It's state-sponsored murder.
It's state-sponsored murder.
So it's kind of like someone murders somebody, and then the state decides that the appropriate punishment is to murder them. However, if they happen to be innocent, then the state is now guilty of having murdered someone.
That's right. And you could compare it to criminal charges like rape. We don't advocate that the criminal should be raped, or if it's an arson, that the arsonist who committed the crime, we don't burn down that person's house. So it's just really an awful state-sponsored killing is really awful.
And so the history, Kristina, has been up and down. I mean, we were just talking before the show started about the fact that in Nebraska they put it to a public referendum. And so a state that formerly did not have the death penalty put it to the people. And the people voted to repeal the repeal.
Exactly. That was a huge setback for all of us in abolitionists, I guess I would say. But we have noticed a lot of trends in the death penalty over the last, really 1976 is kind of the beginning of the modern era of the death penalty. In 1972, there was a case called Furman that essentially abolished the death penalty across the nation because the practices, it was unreliable from the court. But then in 1976, a lot of states reinstated the death penalty, and that's what we consider, like I said, the modern era. Virginia in particular, back in the 90s especially, was really bad, where we're seeing tons of death sentences, lots of executions coming out. And where we are now in 2016, for example, the last execution in Virginia was in 2011, which is more than 5 years ago, which is tremendous. So we are seeing a national decline, I guess I would say, in the death penalty. And one other thing that is really interesting, at least to me, is that in the past we've really looked at whether this is a death state or a non-death state, but what we're finding is that it's really localized at the county level. Recent studies have shown that 2% of the nation's counties are responsible for, I think it's 56% of the national death row population, which is really an astonishing statistic when you think about it, because then, and actually Prince William County in Virginia is included in one of that 2% of the counties in the nation wide.
That is amazing. But you know, it does come down to patterns and practices. For instance, at the top of the hit parade, Paul, were Virginia and Texas vying at one point, whether it was in the 90s or the early 2000s, for which one executed the most people on an annual basis.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I mean, Texas, I still, and you know, correct me if I'm wrong, Adkins versus Virginia kind of looked at executing people who are considered to be intellectually disabled.
That's correct.
You know, but Texas, I believe, was executing quite a number of people that they had identified. And I don't believe they have changed that, have they?
I don't think so, no. We're making some steps in that area, aren't we? We're hoping to get the Virginia legislature to consider legislation that would eliminate mental illness as a
So there's federal cases, obviously, but the states' rights, you know, under our federalist system, obviously the states have a lot of control.
Well, to an extent. So, for example, Atkins started in Virginia, went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and the United States Supreme Court is the law of the land. And so, let's say Atkins is a perfect example because Virginia thought it was okay at that time to execute people that were intellectually disabled, but the Supreme Court said no, it's not. And so that trickle-down effect is supposed to happen at every single jurisdiction where there are courts in place. The problem is local prosecutors, local judges may not interpret the law
determining what that cutoff is, or what that,
exactly,
you know, what is the diagnosis that meets the terms as laid out by that Supreme Court decision.
Exactly.
Well, that does cause a bit of a dilemma, clearly. And we've got a case coming up here in Virginia. You know, in between high-profile cases, people tend not to think about this. There's a lot of issues that need people's attention, and until you have somebody who's going to the electric chair or lethal injection, a lot of people don't think about advocating 365 days a year. And that's the thing about Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. Being an existing organization, you're doing that work every single day. But Ricky Gray is a case that's coming up. He is scheduled for execution on January the 18th, and just today they announced there's going to be a hearing regarding that execution on January 3rd. So, Leslie, what might happen? Why are they going to hold a hearing?
Sure. So what's happened with Mr. Gray's case is he's essentially exhausted all of his appellate remedies in the state. He's already appealed it to the United States Supreme Court, which is why his execution date was stayed from last March. They declined cert. They didn't want to hear his petition. And so now what his lawyers have done is they filed a civil lawsuit in federal district court down in Richmond, where they are essentially asking for a temporary restraining order. And what their challenge is they're challenging Virginia's methods of execution, specifically dealing with lethal injection. And as I'm sure you're aware,
right,
lethal injection has really been a hot topic.
It has.
It's an awful way to phrase it, but it has been in death penalty jurisprudence with all those botched executions that were happening in Oklahoma, Ohio, Alabama earlier this month. And so
they're basically making the argument it's cruel and unusual because the drugs are not doing the job they're supposed to do in the way intended.
Exactly. And so with the three-drug cocktail is sometimes what it's referred to as. There are essentially three drugs that are involved, which I'm not going to pretend to pronounce some of those words, but the important one, at least in Ricky's case, is midazolam. And that's the drug that's been involved in a lot of these botched executions that was happening. And so the reason why it's especially problematic in Virginia is because the General Assembly passed a secrecy bill, which I think we're probably going to get into a little bit later on in the show, shielding the pharmaceutical companies who were producing these drugs. So now Ricky and his lawyers are in the position where how are they supposed to advise him? Because oddly enough in Virginia, the prisoner can elect which way he is to die. And so if we're not even able to understand what drugs are being used, whether or not this, well, we know what drugs are being used, but whether or not this pharmaceutical company is actually accredited, did it pass FDA standards, which just is a whole host of issues. And additionally, for example, Virginia spent $66,000 this year on these drugs that are being used. Last year, I think they spent $525 on the drugs that were used to kill Mr. Prieto. I mean, $66,000 is
a lot of money.
That's an astonishing number, and the reason why it's so high is because pharmaceutical companies don't want their name out there. They don't want to be associated with these executions.
Right.
So
it's a branding marketing problem for them.
Exactly.
But you know, Paul, aren't we, by deflecting some of this, aren't we missing the whole point, which is if it's come down to arguing over the drugs or the method of execution, we're still not focusing on the fact that we shouldn't be killing people.
That's right. State-sponsored killing is still murder, and it's not something that we ought to be involved with.
Absolutely. And so, you know, moving forward, and we're going to talk to you at the end of the show about how people can get involved in the work that VADP is doing. And I do think it's something that people need to pay attention to more than once every 5 years when suddenly someone's on death row and we're like, how are we still doing this in the Commonwealth of Virginia? I think it's something that coming up on this legislative session that we all need to be looking at a lot more closely. So please join us. We're going to come back from this break. We're going to be talking to Nicholas Cote. He's going to join Kristina Leslie. We've got 3 more segments to go, and we are really going to dig into why we need to look at abolishing the death penalty here in Virginia and across the entire United States. So please come back after the break.
One day these rats were playing in the woods. Wanted some matches and that's no good. Listen to smoke before you give it a try. Only you. Don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Cause there's nothing very funny about $3,000. Nothing very nice. Homeless mind. So if a gorgeous force is what you desire, don't play with matches. Don't play with fire.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Fire.
Why don't you just wash your car at home?
When I wash my car, everything runs down the street and down into the storm drains. With all the chemicals in the soaps and waxes, the last thing I want to do is poison my own drinking water. At least here, it's all contained and recycled on site. That's why I also take my car in for oil changes instead of doing it myself. I might take a chance on spilling stuff. You know what the best part is?
What?
More time to kick back and watch the game.
How far would you go to protect the planet?
I want you to build an ark.
Here we go. Okay, that's good. Oh, okay. Ow!
Maybe there's another way.
People, the flood is imminent!
Is it too much to ask for a little precipitation?
Go to fightglobalwarming.com to find out what you and your community can do to reduce global warming pollution.
Somewhere around the world, there are men and women of the armed forces risking their lives, helping rebuild communities after natural disasters, collecting toys for needy children, tutoring kids in school. These are your sons and daughters who work to keep us safe, secure, and free. Dedicated men and women who put their country first.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. We're talking with board members tonight from Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. Joining me is attorney Kristina Leslie, and on this segment is joining me Nicholas Cote, who is the founder of Right Way Forward Virginia. Welcome, Nicholas.
Thank you for having me, Catherine.
So tell us a little bit about why you founded this organization, what the aim of your organization is, keeping in mind that you're also a board member here with VADP.
Correct. It's really two different hats, although there is a connection. I started Right Way Forward Virginia as a nonpartisan libertarian advocacy group. So a lot of the issues that we're focused on are criminal justice reform, ways to alleviate mass incarceration and issues like that. And I came to death penalty advocacy because of the execution secrecy bill that Kristina was talking about earlier, and the coalition that developed in the Virginia General Assembly fighting that. I was really interested as a nonpartisan libertarian in seeing how Democrats, who you would traditionally associate with being against the death penalty, worked with Republicans, including many strongly conservative Tea Party Republicans, against that execution secrecy bill. And they had originally defeated it in 2015. And unfortunately, we weren't successful in defeating it this past year, and it's now law. But that's the kind of coalition that needs to come together, especially in a state like Virginia, where Republicans dominate in the General Assembly. We simply need more of them on board. So that's one of the things that I see as my role on the board of VADP, which is, reaching out to conservatives, libertarians, people who aren't always involved in an issue like this, something that's a social justice issue, but trying to expand the tent and putting pressure on the General Assembly that way.
So as we head into session, which starts really in like 3 weeks, less than 4 weeks, are there members of the General Assembly drafting specific legislation that you want to talk about?
Yeah, well, there's legislation that would prevent people with serious mental illness from being put on death row. So that is legislation that is a step in the right direction, though it's not ultimately what we want, which is total abolishment. But certainly if we can limit it in those cases, we should do so. There's also potential for legislation that we might have to go on defense again, similar to the execution secrecy bill. Unfortunately, not every bill has been filed yet. They're still in the pre-filing period, so it remains to be seen what that is. But people should certainly, if they're interested in this cause, should go to vadp.org, follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook to stay up to date about those kind of things.
Absolutely. So are you involved in the Ricky Gray case specifically or in a general way? What can you tell us a little bit about what's going to happen in January? Because the execution date is set for January 18th, which is right after session starts, which one would imagine would raise the visibility of this issue for both the average Virginian who's going to see it on the headlines of their newspapers, as well as the people sitting in the House and the Senate.
Sure. I'm not involved in Ricky Gray's case. My clients are charged, I deal with clients that are charged at the trial level. So what might happen to Ricky Gray, it sounds like if this civil lawsuit gets some traction, the federal courts may stay his execution again to see if that's an issue that might ripen into something that will be fruitful for his case. There's also always the option that the governor could grant clemency and commute his sentence to life without the possibility of parole.
How often does that ever happen?
Well, that's the problem.
Just asking. How often? I've lived here all my life, so
sure. I'm
trying to recall, and I'm not recalling.
It doesn't happen too often in Virginia, but it has happened. I mean, of course, the year is failing me. I think about 5 or 6 years ago was the last grant of clemency in Virginia, but the Federal Death Penalty Resource Center, I think it's fdp.org, something like that, I'm not sure, has great clemency statistics on that. There have been really broad grants of clemency in other areas. For example, Illinois, again, the dates are eluding me right now, about 10 or 15 years ago cleared their entire death row. 162 folks' sentences were commuted from death sentences to life without the possibility of parole. Same in Maryland. They've emptied their death row as well.
Yeah, Maryland I knew. Yes, I was aware of that. So, Ricky Gray's not the only one slated for 2017. Am I wrong about that, or are there other cases coming up?
Yeah, there are potentially 2 other ones. One issue that we address is whether or not they have the drugs, and I think they claim they do have the drugs for
at least 2.
For at least 2.
That costs $66,000.
But certainly, if we do want to see clemency, and Virginians who agree should absolutely contact the governor and urge him to do so.
So what do you think about the fact that 2% of the counties in this country are responsible for like 56% of the executions, and the fact that Prince William County, Virginia is in that 2%? How do you read that, Nicholas?
Well, it is interesting, and it's a problem, but it shows you that you can really focus resources and where you need to mobilize people. This past election cycle, even though there were some setbacks in California and in Nebraska, there were also some encouraging signs, and actually some district attorneys in those outlier counties lost their re-election fights. So if you raise the issue, if you bring public attention to it, the public can punish those district attorneys who go overboard with the death penalty.
Well, that's very interesting, because we were talking before the show that I read the book Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy, which is an eye-opener. I mean, it's just, to me, a life-changing book to understand what is happening now, today, in Alabama specifically. But judges are elected across the United States, not in Virginia. Our judges are appointed by our legislators. So every legislative delegation in every county appoints the judges there. And I think I mentioned that Justin Fairfax has been working on, with the Virginia Coalition for Diversity in the Judicial System in Virginia, to have a judiciary that's more reflective of the people who live here. Commonwealth's attorneys and prosecutors and judges. And I think that is something is long overdue. We do need to look at patterns and practices and where we can connect the dots in Virginia. So given that in Alabama, judges are elected, a lot of them see a high execution rate as a great way of campaigning for a judgeship.
At the same time, though, I think it was in Kansas, there were a number of judges that wasn't the case for, so they were kind of targets for defeat because they weren't judges who were in favor of executing a lot of people, and they actually were able to survive. So it kind of goes both ways. Or is this probably cultural? Nebraska is certainly not Alabama. There can be cultural differences. Sometimes just the individual candidates are better. Things like that. But we are making a lot of progress on our side. This is an issue where increasingly more and more conservatives are coming around on the issue. Even though I consider myself more of a libertarian, I used to be a board member of the Republican Liberty Caucus of Virginia. I always traditionally voted Republican, that kind of thing, and I was in favor of the death penalty, in fact. So I'm one person who has changed my mind on this, and I know I'm not alone. I know, talking with other young conservatives especially, that's an increasingly common position, that many more of them agree that it's way too expensive. The possibility of executing innocent people, should just outrage, I think, everyone.
We have. I mean,
well,
clearly,
we have.
We have executed innocent people.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And just the fact that we know the statistics you cited earlier of, we've had 156 exonerations, and Paul mentioned, that's 1 out of every 11 executions we have. So just think, how many more there are out there that we don't know about, and just the fact that it could be 1. Only 1 really is too many.
It is too many because it's murder. Whether the state does it or any other player does it, when you take an innocent person's life, it's murder. And so 1 is too many. So let me ask you, do you think being a millennial, can I use that term? I meant it in only I'm a mother of millennials, so I feel like I can say that. But do you think that this is a generational thing? Do you think the younger generation will push this movement forward?
Yeah, perhaps. That's likely. I think there are a number of reasons for that, one of which might be just the fact that crime rates are lower, and that's probably a good thing for the cause and criminal justice reform in general. You can't really scare people quite the way that you used to, about violent crime. So it's possible, and I certainly think the numbers are there as well.
And I think it is an issue because it's really a human rights issue.
Yes.
I mean, 2/3 of the rest of the world seems to get it. They don't have either capital punishment is abolished on the books or essentially a moratorium's been in place where no one's been executed. I think Amnesty International standard is at 10 years. And so, I mean, we are truly alone on this issue when compared to the rest of the world, and I think that that is where we need to be headed. And like I said, it's a human rights issue because, sorry, I get too excited about this. Go ahead, I'll let you.
Well, I was just going to say, the fact that you were saying that we're standing alone apart from the rest of the world on this, but mass incarceration, clearly we talk about it all the time.
Right.
You know, 25% of the world's population, or whatever that statistic is, we've got way more people in prison than any other developed nation in the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for a country that's supposedly founded on the ideals of freedom and equality under the law, it's really an outrage that we lock up more people per capita than anywhere else in the world.
And that was the point that I was trying to make that I forgot, is that I am by no means for the death penalty, but if the death penalty is to be constitutional, it's supposed to be a reliable process. And there are so many flaws in the system that a lot of people just don't know about, a lot of just inherent unfairness about the process. For example, let's say you have a case where someone's going to trial. In order to be a juror on that capital trial, you have to be in favor of the death penalty. So already people who are morally opposed to the deth penalty don't even get to sit on that jury to hear that case.
I had no
so
idea.
Then you kind of already have like a super gung-ho, aggressive jury that decides that fate. And that's tremendous.
It is.
That's tremendous. But a lot of people don't know about that. So just the odds are so stacked against you as a capital litigant or defendant facing the death penalty just in the system. And that's law. I mean, it's the law.
That is crazy. And the fact that we've got 50 states and each state gets to decide, because it has not been decided or abolished at the federal level by, let's say, the Supreme Court or our Congress, each state gets to decide for themselves. So we've got, I think you were saying 16 states either there's either a moratorium or they've abolished it. Is that about right, 16 out of 50?
I think
it's about 31 states that have an active death penalty right now.
Yeah.
Right, but as far as the ones who don't, who absolutely are not executed.
I think it's around 19.
19, that absolutely have decided, however they've decided, that we're not going to execute people.
Right.
It's just we had that little blip with Nebraska having put it, and that's the danger with putting anything on a referendum. I told people, the last time we amended our Constitution in Virginia, it was declared that marriage was between one man and one woman.
Right.
And now it's just kind of dead language on our Constitution because the world changed. So I hear our cue music coming up. Please join us when we come back for the second half of our show. I'm talking with members of the Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, and we want to discuss in greater detail how we are going to approach the session coming up in just a few weeks.
Around the world, 1 out of every 3 women will be beaten or otherwise abused in their lifetime, often by a family member or loved one. A future free from violence. It's all she's ever wished for.
Did you know you have the power to stop children from joining gangs? You can help a father find a job and home for his family. You can assist a woman who can't afford the medicine she needs to live and the home she can't live without. You can choose to make a difference in our community. Support Volunteers of America, and you can help improve the lives of nearly 2 million Americans each year with programs and services that help individuals and families overcome their challenges to become as independent as possible. Support the programs that are working in our community. Contact Volunteers of America today. Call 1-800-899-0089.
For some folks, saving for the future is easy, but for you, it might take a little more effort. Saving for your future is your responsibility, and there's a lot to save for.
I never thought of that.
Like your child's education, perhaps uncovered medical expenses, or just to be sure you can live the way you want when you retire. The time is now to save for tomorrow. Save now or work forever. The choice is yours. Choose to save.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. Tonight we're talking with board members from Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. Joining me on this segment is attorney Kristina Leslie and Nicholas Cote. Thank you both so much for being here. So when we took our break, we were talking about basically things that are happening on the state level and the federal level. And Nicholas, you have spoken before about the coalition, the bipartisan coalition, not only looking at the death penalty, but just mass incarceration.
Yeah, mass incarceration, criminal justice reform. There's bipartisan agreement that sentencing requirements, mandatory minimums are outrageous, that we're locking way too many people up, a lot of them for nonviolent drug crime, that there's this school to prison pipeline that needs to be addressed. There's so many reforms that we need to make in the criminal justice system. And I'm optimistic that we're going to make those changes in addition to ultimately ending the death penalty. So
do you think, and again, we've just elected a new president, and so moving forward, what happens in the Congress really is not just the priority of the White House. I mean, they can decide in both the Senate and in the House of Representatives that mass incarceration is a problem that they can address and deal with. How likely do you think that that's going to happen in the first couple of years of this new presidency?
Well, I think the votes are there in Congress right now, even in the Republican-dominated Congress, in favor of sentencing reform, for starters at least, as well as possibly something like asset forfeiture reform. That's a little off topic. But certainly the votes are there if they have the political will to do it. So that's why it's important for people to get involved, for people to sign up for organizations like VADP and other criminal justice reform organizations, call their members of Congress and demand a vote and demand action.
So more locally, going into session, which starts, I think
January 11th.
January 11th and goes the first week of March, and we all the bills have not been filed yet. We're in a pre-file, but people need to. Is the VADP.org website the place to look for bills?
Yeah, absolutely. We will have links to the relevant bills, ways to contact their own delegates and senators. And action alerts, things like that. They can sign up for an email list where they'll get action. If there's going to be a vote tomorrow in a Courts of Justice committee, we'll tell them about that.
And I think because I work with a lot of organizations who come on the show, and we talk about things like organizing, and these representatives in the Senate and in the House care about hearing from their constituents specifically.
Absolutely.
So you need to call your own person, and you need to say, I'm in your district, I voted for you, or I didn't vote for you, or I won't vote for you, and this is what I want you to do on this bill, because the offices do keep track. They have software. I found this out doing lobby days. They have software in those offices as to who shows up, who emails, who calls, and whether or not those people are constituents. So if you think your email doesn't make a difference, if you think showing up to say, I want to talk to you about this doesn't make a difference, it absolutely makes a difference. These are the fundamentals of organizing. And I think, beyond what's going to happen on Capitol Hill, people really from January 11th until the first week in March, people really need to be focused on how they can engage with their state representatives.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I mentioned earlier that because of the Republican dominance in the General Assembly, I think it's especially key for those constituents who are conservative or moderate, or they're in conservative districts, who are opposed to the death penalty or opposed to expansion at least, or support some sort of criminal justice reform, that they in particular step up and have their voices heard, or they reach out to their colleagues, their friends and neighbors who are like-minded, so that we can get pressure on those members of the General Assembly who are really going to make the difference.
So your executive director, Michael Stone, awesome guy, is he ever contacted about finding people to go in front of subcommittee hearings or committee hearings when bills like this come up? You talked about the Courts of Justice Committee. A lot of things die at 7 o'clock in the morning in subcommittee hearings when they don't actually keep track of roll call votes. And so I know getting people to come sit down and to actually testify in front of these committees are really important. Is that something your organization gets involved in?
Yeah, absolutely. If you have a connection to the cause, if you're somebody who we've had the abolition movement has many of its most prominent members are families of murder victims who are themselves opposed to the death penalty. They believe in mercy. And if you are a voice like that, absolutely, we want to make sure you have that voice heard at the General Assembly.
And of course, you work with specific cases that you can't talk about because you can't talk about specific cases. But in a general sense, what is the progression from once somebody enters into a capital case?
Right.
What happens and how can you best help families or help people who find themselves in a capital case?
Right. Capital cases are horrific. I mean, we all know that the facts of what happened that day are particularly bad, but there are more victims involved than necessarily the victims whose lives were taken that day. And the thing about it, too, is that capital litigation goes on for a very long time. A very, very long time if you're talking about going to trial, appeals, which can last anywhere for decades. So
but that has saved some people's lives, because the people exonerated who've been there for 16 years, as Paul was telling us, if they had executed them any sooner, they would have executed the wrong person. So yeah, you lost 16 years of your life, but you're not dead.
Yeah, we had someone like that here in Virginia, Earl Washington, who was convicted in the early 80s, I believe, and was finally pardoned in 2000 by Governor Gilmore, I believe, even though DNA evidence had exonerated him in the early 90s. So it took a lot of time, even for him, after we knew he was innocent, for him to finally be pardoned. So it can take a long time, and that's just totally unjust.
It is, but there's a reason that there are so many appellate steps that people have.
Right, and I guess I don't want to misspeak. What I was saying is, yes, there's obviously an exhaustive appellate process because death is final, and there's no bringing people back once the state has executed them. And I guess what I was saying was, for the victims, there's never really a sense of closure because this process goes on for a very long time where you're still having to come back to court, still having to deal with some of these issues. And a lot of folks just want closure.
That's true.
And so when we're talking about death penalty cases, it's not death or the person is freed from prison and is walking around the street. We're literally talking about life without the possibility of parole, spending the rest of your life in prison, which is a very severe, extremely severe punishment, or dying. And also with, like I was saying before earlier in the segment, the death penalty is only constitutional if the process is reliable. And we're seeing, again, with this geographic disparity of the 2% of the counties, we're seeing that a lot of attorneys, I come from an office that has fairly decent resources, I would say still not enough to try these sorts of cases, but there are some folks who are not knowledgeable, they have horrible attorneys, and it's just kind of the luck of the draw. There are some folks, African Americans, young folks, depending on the race of the victims, can have so much interplay into whether or not that individual is susceptible to the death penalty, which is just outrageous. That's not supposed to be considered, but when human beings who are fallible persons are deciding the outcome of a case, it's never going to be a perfect, fair system. And I think that we need to ask ourselves as a society, when is enough enough? How much are we willing to tolerate? And I think personally that abolition is in our history. I was hoping it would be in my lifetime. Right now, I'm not really sure. We have some setbacks this year. But I think 50 years from now, looking back, I would ask someone, don't you want to be on the right side of history? I mean, you never hear anybody saying oh yeah, I was for slavery back in the day, because you never hear about these people, And I think that the death penalty, this is my beliefs, is I feel just as strongly about that. It's going to be abolished. It's just a question of when and how do we get there? How do we join the rest of the world?
And that's why, to me, the Brian Stevenson book, and I keep referencing it because it is one of the best books ever, walking people through what it's like, what it is to have somebody facing execution and trying to save someone is innocent, but you can't necessarily prove it. And what you were talking about, poverty, race, levels of education, geographic location, the South, hello. I mean, look at the map. And so where you were born and what color you were born and whether you had the, unfortunate of being poor and not having access to the resources to know what your rights are even. Disadvantages, I think if you look at who gets paraded into the execution chamber, there's a profile there. And it matches up with our mass incarceration problem.
Yeah, absolutely. There's another case that I like to talk about. It's a case that I followed sort of in real time as it was happening when I was in college a decade ago. And that was a case in Mississippi involving a man named Corey May. Corey May had no criminal record whatsoever, but he happened to live on the other side of a duplex next to somebody who is suspected of dealing drugs. And in the middle of the night, police officers came into his house, and there's some disagreement about whether or not they announced themselves first. He claims they didn't. And raided his side of the duplex in order to find drugs. They found, I believe, 1 joint. And he didn't hear them announce that they were police officers, and his instinct kicked in. He thought his home was being invaded in the middle of the night.
Home invasion.
So he protected his infant daughter, and he fired a gunshot that killed the police officer. And he was eventually convicted of murder and put on death row. Even his case kind of became a cause across the ideological spectrum for a lot of reasons. Conservatives thought this is a man defending his family and home with his gun. That's something that we believe in. This is self-defense. And there were racial issues on display. He had ineffective assistance of counsel. The trial was moved from his predominantly black county to a neighboring predominantly white county, where there were then only 2 African Americans on the jury.
Right.
Issues like that happen all the time. And that's the kind of racial disparities, the fact that he didn't originally have effective counsel, that, when we have these exonerations that we talk about, it's not always, something like DNA evidence that comes out. It can be the fact that there was ineffective assistance of counsel, and somebody later figures it out and figures out what went wrong, and they get new attorneys who take over the case and do a much better job for them. So it's making sure that, defendants have adequate counsel, and that's something that every state also has control over. They can make sure the public defender's office is adequately funded and things like that, and make sure that everybody gets a fair trial.
It's interesting you say that, because I was at a session in St. Louis listening to a panel about more women in the judicial system, and a woman from Dade County, Florida, who's been the prosecutor there, I've been a prosecutor there for 15 years, was saying prosecutors decide which cases actually are going to be heard and how they're going to be heard. And she goes, too many women go into public defense, they become public defenders, but she goes, more women and more people of color need to consider the fact that being on the prosecutorial side of this is where it's also going to make a difference.
I would say sometimes, because that person always has a boss who sometimes calls the shots and has an agenda. So I think that depends.
I think it depends, but how often do you see diversity among prosecutors? I mean, is that something that you have found here in Virginia?
Not in Virginia, no.
Yeah, and so you can understand why I'm kind of plugged into this thing that Justin Fairfax is doing, because once somebody shows you something that you haven't seen before, but now you can clearly see it because somebody just showed it to you, that's sort of the way I feel about looking at the judicial system in Virginia. It's like I'm seeing it through a different prism. So please join us when we come back from the break.
Books at the library.
There's more than just books at the library.
Excuse me.
There's more than just books at the library.
Il y a plus que de livres à la bibliothèque.
Hello. You have a lot of great books here today. You know there's more than just books at the library.
I know.
There's more than just books at the library.
I don't want to be hooked to a machine.
I want all the medical treatment available to me.
I wouldn't want my family to have to make this decision.
My doctor knows what's best for me.
An advance directive is your life on your terms. Talk with your family. Decide what's right for you. Then put it in writing.
Documenting my wishes today means my family won't have to make heart-wrenching decisions later.
To learn more, visit www.putitinwriting.org.
1,200 American youth run away from their homes every day. The National Runaway Switchboard is here to help. 1-800-RUNAWAY. If you are a runaway, Thinking about running away from home, or a parent or guardian concerned about issues facing your child, call us 24 hours a day. 1-800-RUNAWAY. In times of crisis, hope is just a phone call away. 1-800.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. Joining me tonight are board members from the organization Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. Here in the last segment, I'm being joined by Paul O'Shea and Nicholas Cote. Thank you, gentlemen. This has been very informative. I'm sure all of our viewers feel this way. And I want to just wrap up the show by talking specifically about the work of VADP. Both of you are on the board of directors. This organization is specific to Virginia. It's been around since 1991. How can people find out more, get involved, support your efforts?
I think the first thing they can do is to check our website, which has a complete listing of the activities that we're involved with. And we have a tremendous executive director, Michael Stone. He's served on the board. He served with the National Coalition to abolish the death penalty, and that's where I first met him. He's what I call a brilliant hire, and does a lot of really great work working with the faith communities in the state. He travels a lot, going to various parts of the Commonwealth, and just does a really terrific job.
Yeah, one of the things that he does is he hosts regional meetings all around the Commonwealth, getting to know activists in different parts of the state, and making sure they know how to get involved as well. And so that's something that anybody can do who agrees. They can contact us and say, hey, I'd like to host a meeting, have Michael over, and then invite over some of their like-minded friends and colleagues and things like that, and get them on board as well.
Right, and faith communities are kind of an obvious one. The Unitarian Universalists of Fairfax, UUCF, is where I first saw him actually conduct a regional meeting. It was extremely well attended. I know he was in Roanoke. I connected him with Mary Croft, who's a friend of mine down there. And so, in addition to faith communities, what other kinds of social organizations might be a good partner for VADP?
Well, certainly the ACLU is involved.
Right.
There's organizations that are committed to, issues involving mental illness. So we're partnering with them right now on the serious mental illness ban. There's so many different kinds of social justice organizations out there that are dedicated to social justice, criminal justice reform, issues like that, and we're happy to partner with them.
That's good to know, because this is not something that's specific to even though we talked a lot about the 2% of counties feeding 56% of the executions, still you don't know what's going to happen in any particular county in Virginia where you end up with a high profile case that puts a community in the spotlight. So I do think it's people even in the more rural parts of Virginia, this is a resource. VADP is a resource where people on the ground really need to be more informed about Virginia's position on this. We still continue to be, in the United States, a state that has a fair number of executions. Like I said, I think at one point we were neck and neck with Texas. I don't know how nationally those figures look anymore. I think you're right about the trend that it's slowing down somewhat.
It's slowing down, but it's too high, and until we get to zero, which is what we're trying to do, this is not good for the country or the Commonwealth. Just an interesting anecdote that follows this. My wife and I were taking a train from Chicago to San Francisco. We took the California Zephyr, and during the communal dining, we sat down with a couple from Richmond, Virginia. He happened to be a Baptist minister, and I started talking about the death penalty in the state, and so we're hoping to get him involved in our work. So the issue is never far away. It's state by state. It's something that really concerns everyone.
And of course, in the South, you generally find it's more conservative there, but there are other states where you would think it would be more liberal, and for instance, California.
California has a very high number of death row prisoners.
And that seems to run counter to what we believe about California.
There are really 2 or 3 different Californias. You know, so the stereotype that exists isn't exactly
right. You think
right,
of it as being kind of more liberal,
yeah.
and you know, and I'm looking at the map of who still has the death penalty. It's not just the South. You know, it's all across the West as well.
That's right. That's right. California had the recent referendum that attempted to have the state overturn the death penalty, but it lost fairly narrowly. It wasn't overwhelming number, but it did in fact lose there, despite some really wonderful work by Mike Farrell, who was on MASH. I don't know if you remember.
Oh yes, I do. Yes, I do. Yes, right. I do remember him.
And he has death penalty focus there. They do wonderful work, but they just couldn't get it over the line this year. But they will eventually.
Well, and so we keep chipping away at it. You know, getting cases in front of the Supreme Court, getting getting legislation at the state level. We have now said that if you're intellectually disabled, you can't be executed. If you're a juvenile, that's fairly recent. If you're a juvenile, you can't be executed. I mean, that's not like 100 years ago. That's like very recently. And now we're looking at mental illness. And I know that you have said that this is going to be something that's going to be introduced here at the Virginia state level. Is that something we're going to see a push for at the national level?
Probably not yet, but there's so much work.
Yeah, you would see similar efforts in states across the country, but
not
in that sense it's
yeah.
national. But because these are state level decisions, that's where the decisions will be made. But we do have that in Virginia coming up. There's legislation that will be introduced if it hasn't already been pre-filed. So please, contact your member of the General Assembly and tell them to support it.
And as far as who gets involved in drafting the legislation, or who's sponsoring the legislation, because you referenced the fact that there is a strong bipartisan coalition, and you definitely need the Republicans in a legislature that's controlled by Republicans. So who should we be looking toward as in leadership roles on this?
Well, frankly, we talked about the execution secrecy bill earlier. And when that was defeated in the 2015 session, it was this coalition of, the entire Democratic caucus, but then more or less a third of the House Republicans originally opposed that. They had strong reservations about the lack of transparency, that it wasn't good government, that the people have the right to know. And many of them also, even if they still say they support the death penalty, many of them have reservations. And an issue like mental illness is a way to tap into those reservations.
So
they might not be in favor of repealing the death penalty entirely,
but they're narrowing it.
But they're narrowing it down, and this is a first step that they might be able to take.
Right, and this again, talking about connecting the dots and looking at the larger issues, funding for mental health care in Virginia continues to be a struggle. I mean, on so many fronts, not enough money is allocated for the treatment of mental illness. Jails are still being used to house the mentally ill. And so narrowing how culpable someone who is mentally ill may be in a capital case, again, the goalposts keep moving in the sense that how do you determine that? So it seems to me that right along with legislation to narrow who can be executed in Virginia, we really do have to look as a companion piece to that, putting more resources behind diverting the mentally ill from our jails into appropriate treatment facilities. And you had mentioned something too about the nonviolent crimes around drug charges. I mean, drug-related.
Yeah, not just drugs, but as another example, the state of Virginia has not increased the monetary threshold at which a crime becomes grand larceny since, I believe, 1980, and it's one of the lowest in the country. Basically, you could steal an iPhone and get a felony, and that's something across the country that many conservatives are realizing, especially what a total waste of our criminal justice system and the taxpayer resources it takes, to prosecute a case like that. So states like even Texas, which obviously hasn't come around on the death penalty yet, but they've kind of been a forerunner, and it's what's called right on crime approach, that they believe we need to think about how we spend taxpayer dollars on the criminal justice system. We need to make sure that we're not throwing people in jail for petty crimes, and ruining their lives and preventing them from improving their lives and getting a step back up. That we just perpetuate poverty and perpetuate, people having mental illnesses that go untreated.
Right. So we're going to be focused on January 3rd on whatever this hearing is going to decide about the fate of Ricky Gray. He is scheduled for execution January 18th. There's a possibility that there might be another execution or two in 2017. So the work of VADP continues simply because we have immediate need. I mean, we have an immediate case to look at.
We do, and that's why it's so important for everyone who watches programs like this to get in touch with the issue and stay in touch.
Right.
Yeah, and for those executions, whether it's one or three, there will be vigils on those execution days. That's a way to get involved and to meet other people in the movement. So, come out, on those days and just show the public, that you take this issue seriously, that you believe in mercy, that you oppose the death penalty.
And again, to your point, both of your points, this is a moral issue. Murdering someone who has murdered someone else is still murder. To your point, we don't rape rapists, we don't burn down the houses of arsonists. So to say that murder is an appropriate response to someone who has committed murder would seem to be a non sequitur if people stop to consider it from that point of view. This is a moral issue.
Yeah, and there's that's something that I used to really actually disagree about. And there's a quote I like from the former Republican Attorney General of Virginia, Mark Earley,
right,
who as the Attorney General of Virginia was involved in the execution process, and he saw it firsthand, and he came away opposing it. And what he says is, I can still intellectually make an argument in favor of the death penalty, but it's tired, it's strained, and I don't care to make it anymore. And I feel the same way, and I think a lot of people are increasingly feeling the same way. Yeah, we need to just continue making that appeal, making that moral appeal,
and people need to be vocal.
showing the risk of executing innocents and just how totally unacceptable that is, pointing these stories that we talk about, Earl Washington here in Virginia, all of the issues that go along with it, the racial disparities, the ineffective assistance of counsel. Those are things, even if you theoretically, intellectually agree with the death penalty, that we can point to those things and say, but it's not fair. It doesn't work. And the fact that we've had those 156 exonerations, one for every 11 executions, we need to do something about it.
I would agree with you, and I appreciate you gentlemen being on the show so much.
Well, thank you for having me.
So VADP.org, you've got a Facebook page, your Twitter, do you have a Twitter account?
Yes, we do.
And what is the Twitter handle?
I believe it's VADP. But
that would make sense, VADP. But you are out on social media. People can find out information. I hope that people will definitely keep January 3rd, January 18th on their radar and get involved to help support the work of Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. Thank you, gentlemen, so much.
Thank you.